So I'm super delighted to be able to talk with you, Phoebe, for our Banging Racks TV episode, and to talk a little bit about who you are and what you do. There's a lot of different hats that you wear in kind of the creative sphere. So yeah, I'd love to maybe as a starting point, hear a little bit about your superpowers and the different areas that you work in the creative realm.
Well, thanks so much, Danielle. This is great. Yeah, I work in a few different capacities as an artist and within the arts and the digital arts. And they seem kind of disconnected, but I don't believe they are. So I'm a colorist. That's sort of the day job thing, where which is like doing Photoshop essentially for films. And I studied painting and filmmaking in school, and the idea of how you light something. I also studied Renaissance art for a semester in Florence. And so I studied all these different ways of how you light something and how you pull something out of the darkness. And so I love that part about color work, because you're really trying to accentuate the important parts of the image. And, anyway, and then I also am an illustrator and 2D animator. And collaborative artist that way. And I'm working on this exciting VR project that takes sort of all of those different things and puts them together. Yeah.
Nice, yeah. So what is it that draws you to the kind of work that you do? I mean, it's funny. It's kind of like Photoshop and the colorist work you do. I loved, when I got to come into your studio at the one point and you showed me a little bit of the arcane art of what it is that you actually do. And it's deep, like the level of depth that there is and the subtlety of what you're evoking from really
Yes.
subtle changes to the color is amazing.
And I think that as colorists go, there's a few different ways that people work. And I am much more on the fine art side in the way that I approach it. Because it's highly technical. A lot of it is figuring out what, because there are so many different color spaces and cameras, and the sensors pick up the colors in different ways, depending on the settings and depending on the different manufacturer. And so being able to work in a fine-tuned way so that all matches is one thing, but then also being able to come in and say, like, okay, so we have somebody and their skin is maybe a little bit desaturated and blending in with the background. How do we pull out the important parts? And it's these subtle changes in the midtones usually. And a thing I always end up talking about with people in that situation, and that always shocks people, is that all skin tones are almost identical. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, all skin tones are almost identical. They are on just a couple of very tiny little sliders. So I am the person who makes someone look less like a tomato on film. Yes. Or
more.
I am the person who makes them look more like a tomato on film because they're supposed to be flushed. Because we have deep emotional responses to those subtle changes that can happen to our skin. We can see, if somebody, the under part of their eyes, if that's kind of a darker color, there's an ominous feeling in that. So I'll just play up whatever is narratively important that way. And so much of it is just intuitive. We don't even notice. We don't notice it. So it's it's very, very technical that way, but it's also extremely artistic and creative that way too.
So I'm really curious about how you find, because I mean, again, your animation is really neat and you work in a range of different styles and environments with the animation that you do. How do you find, like, does that get informed by the level of nuance within your colorist work that you're doing? Or how do those two relate for you?
Oh, they play back and forth with each other very well, actually. Each time I do oftentimes, because a colorist project is much more, it's a quicker process. I sit down, I go through it, and it tends to be more straightforward, whereas the animation tends to require a fair amount of research and sketching and back and forth, and a lot more fine detail. So I tend to find after doing an interesting animation project that then when I come back to doing a colorist project, that I instantly see those tiny things that I just learned in my previous research.
Nice. And what do you love about the animation type work that you get to do? What are the things that really draw you to that?
Well, I have kind of a weird niche in animation in that I don't rig things up really. I do a little bit of that, but I don't do like a cartoon style. I do a very like painterly. People tend to think it's either a watercolor or an oil paint. And I often do more of an animatic style that way with like parallax um, and that works very, very well in live theater contexts. So I've done a lot of collaborations with live theaters that way, in part because when you're looking at something and you're expecting a set and you see these layers of things, it reads that way to you. And it's almost more real for the fact that it's not real at all.
Okay. I'd love to hear more about that piece because I know you've done a range of different live theater animation collaborations. And it's such an interesting way to do immersive art. And so, I mean, what's that been like? What's a project maybe that you have found super fun for you, or that you found really interesting in terms of that?
I was really lucky before we moved. I'm from Philadelphia, and I worked with, there was a neat live theater that we got to know through when my husband and I owned a movie theater, and we can get to that later. But, and they were trying to figure out how to do collaborations between film, artists, and they just came to me and said, "Hey, you're an artist. Can we work with you on this?" And I'd been doing some educational animations at the time, but so I didn't even know where to start. But they suggested doing the original radio show of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and that because it's a radio show and you want something in the background, what do we do? So that ended up being the kind of initial fun challenge that way. And we worked really hard together and came up with something extremely fun. And people had a great time with it. So I worked with them on a number of projects. The most fun was the last one that I did, which was we were able to, because we'd done these things enough for a while, we were able to work with the Middle Earth Enterprises, the Tolkien estate, or the Tolkien licensing company, to do The Hobbit this way. And that was so much fun. So first of all, I got to read The Hobbit about 1,000 times, which is just it's a wonderful book, and pull out what each character would look like, and then we had to submit each illustration to them first. And the gentleman, his name was Joe Madrigrona at the Middle Earth Enterprises, ended up being just the nicest guy, really engaged, really thoughtful. And he would either come back and say, "Oh, this is great," or he'd say, "Well, Elven architecture at the time would have reflected some," and I'd have to, you don't get a book on Elven architecture because it's not real. Like, how do you? So I'd go back over Tolkien's own illustrations and the writings and the Art Nouveau influences of the time, and I'd try and, create something, send that back, and and we'd have this great back and forth about it. And it was the most kind of delightful client feedback I've ever gotten. Like, and it was always about elves. Like, he was very meticulous about elves and their sort of historic hairstyles and what they, so that was fantastic. That was just, as a project, extraordinarily rewarding, in like, it felt like play.
Nice. Oh, that's great. So when you're looking at different projects that are possibly there, what draws you, whether that's to a team or whether that's to the content that's going to be there or the technical side of what you're going to be doing, what attracts you to a project? What are the ones you find most interesting?
Well, I'd say especially collaborating with that particular theater, and I've done some other live theater collaborations that have been great too, but that particular theater had a really generative foundation to it. And they really were focused on how to take live theater forward. It was very much the like yes and attitude, but with a lot of just extremely creative, enthusiastic, talented, kind, and just fun people. Like we laughed a lot while doing them, and so working with people who aren't going to shoot things down, they're going to listen, and they're going to, you know, try and find, even if it's a ridiculous idea, they're going to run with it for a little bit, see if it works. That kind of collaboration, I find, is just extremely rewarding, and you will always get a better answer. The thing you come to in the end is always going to be better if what you've done is you've heard people and you've talked with them and you've tried to really understand their perspective and what they're going for.
Yeah, so sort of the yes and rather than
Exactly.
no but crowd. Yeah, that makes all kinds of sense. So tell a bit more about this theater that you, or this, yeah, the theater that you ran.
So back in our old town, which was, it's an inner ring suburb of Philadelphia. It's called Lansdowne, Pennsylvania. And it's right there next to West Philly. And there was this amazing old Art Deco movie theater that had been vacant for a very long time. And we got a grant along with some other nonprofit, to use a portion of it to build a small digital theater. And this was the very beginning of when film and digital were starting to switch over. And my husband and I both worked in theater, and my husband has a degree in acting. I mean, we just have this creative background. So we came up with a plan to make a micro theater, a micro cinema. We called it Cinema 16:9, which is very like almost antiquated now, because now we have the different aspect ratios. But anyway, it widescreen and digital were both kind of the new exciting things, and we were really pushing for that. And so we built this little 3-screen theater that showed independent films, showed kind of stuff that got lost. We did a thing that was a little like Mystery Science Theater on Tuesdays. We called it Terrible Tuesdays. And we'd show something that was in the public domain and, you know, sell pizza, and everybody would laugh. We did Rocky Horror Picture Show, and that was like our Black Friday. We did it for 2 weeks around Halloween. And so there, and my kids were really little at the time, so it was rather ridiculous. I'd be out there like vacuuming rice from between things at 3 a.m. and like go home and wake up with the kids in the morning. So it was a little crazy, but we worked with a lot of independent distributors too. And we got to know that most theaters use a film buyer, but in part because we were working on such a small scale. And we were really looking for niche programming that would appeal to our specific location, and draw out the kind of audiences that we were looking for. So we would reach out independently to the distributors and negotiate with them. And that was extremely valuable in a way, because we were able to kind of fine tune. So oftentimes there were times where we showed, Chico and Rita, I think it was called. Oh, it's a beautiful animated Cuban film. And we showed it, and for 2 weeks, like week 1, nobody came, or, you know, whatever. Week 2, it started to get better and better and better. And then we only had our contract for 2 weeks. And then the last 2 days, there was a whole article on Fresh Air on the NPR station about it. And it opened at the bigger down the way, and we're like, argh! But we had good instincts that way. And it did teach us what people wanted to see. And it also taught us that the hardest thing to do is get people to leave what they're doing to watch your content.
Right. Yeah. So it's neat that you had sort of that focus on a lot of indie film that was there too. And similarly in your colorist work and some of the other work that you do, I know that you're pretty deeply entrenched in that indie film world. And, you know, you've worked on a lot of, award-winning pieces that are making the festival circuit and that kind of a thing. Tell me a little about your relationship with that indie film world.
Well, it's the most interesting place. It's where the dynamic, that it's like the dynamic edge of what's going on in film. I've never been like a Hollywood person. I've never loved blockbuster films. I've always really appreciated people who are using the moving image to tell stories and to express something artistically. And so I'm just drawn to it. It's the thing that I find engaging.
Nice. Yeah. How did you get started in doing all of this? Like, was this something that you always knew you wanted to do? And what was the road in to having this as opposed to getting, say, a traditional 9 to 5 kind of job?
Well, I grew up around artists. I knew I wanted to be an artist. I would have been very surprised in high school if I met me now and I said, you're going to be super into the cutting edge technology, because I was a neo-Luddite. Like if I went to the conferences and stuff, I was very upset about the idea that media companies were owned by such a small, uh, that the messaging was so top down. And now with user generated content, the opposite's true. So I knew I wanted to be part of the arts. I grew up around artists. My grandmother was a painter and printmaker and had a dear friend of mine was a pinhole photographer, actually, who pioneered a lot of the non-silver processes. Yeah, and she would develop so she'd build these giant pinhole boxes, and I'd help her as a little kid, and then she'd develop them in her tub, her bathtub, and then print them, do contact printing in these old 19th century boxes with the little cranks that out in the sun. And it was so beautiful. So I grew up around this, and then she'd paint different colors of light sensitive emulsions. So they end up having anyway, it was fantastic and really formative for me. Then in like 1996, she got a Canon digital camera and fell in love with pixels. She was like, so she'd use these sort of low resolution images. She got Photoshop. She taught me how to use Photoshop when I was like, I don't know, 1997 or something. I mean, I was in high school, and we played around with, okay, so if we add a little green to this, if we add a little blue here, and that was all sort of my awakening to technology and my awakening to color and my awakening to the fact that the digital side of things could be really interesting. And the thing that I love about what she did too is that she appreciated these sort of low res images and then would print them as negatives, as 3 levels of negatives. And then she'd do her same sun printing with them. So you have this beautiful thing that looks like a pinhole picture or looks like a painting, except for there's pixels in it. And she was so excited about finding where the break point is in the cutting edge technology, where that flaw is, and then finding art as exploring that.
Yeah. So kind of rather than looking at how do we make this as crystal clear, realistic as it can, like what's the stuff that's the actual texture and grain of the process that you're using.
Yeah, exactly. And that is something, okay, so there's a colorist that I collaborate with sometimes. He's been a great mentor for me and we're good friends. And he and I have one thing that we kind of differ on. He was a cinematographer in the film era and I wasn't. And so when he's trying to make something look filmic, he always puts a little bit of film grain onto it, which is like takes a scan of film grain and very carefully composites it into the image. And I don't, because I'm like, why would I want to put artifacts from the process of a different medium on top of it? Whereas for him, he's like, well, it's not going to look like a film until it has this. So I'd rather find the artifacts in the current process. So that's the place that I see that particular thing happening in my life now.
Really neat. That's super cool to be exploring. So if you could go back and give like early Phoebe any advice to help her get to where to what you're doing, or a different way to look at it is, for anyone who'd be watching this and who's like, what she's doing is so totally cool, how do I get involved in this? What would you want to tell them?
Well, I have actually no idea at all about how, because I think each it's been very like circuitous how but for color, people have asked, because there isn't an obvious route for learning to be a colorist. There are some like tutorials out there, and you can learn to do anything online really. And but for actually being able to do it as a profession, that is actually a very difficult question, because there isn't an easy, obvious answer, except for to just do it, in which case you have to tell someone you can do it.
Right.
So it's like kind of a chicken and egg situation there. So I think, just practice, just find stuff to practice on. And one of the things that I think was a real blessing for me in that is that when we were back in Philadelphia, the indie world is just, it exists, but it doesn't have the same quality level that there is here. In that, a way that I like to describe it is like, maybe their cables are a little bit old. Maybe the audio cable has some fuzz in it, like because they've borrowed it from somebody. And they're not going to use like a Red camera or an Arri or something. They're going to be using, a Sony or a Canon or something, which is great. It's great, but they're not. It's the quality of what they're going to be getting is lower. And so all of the projects that I did were with problematic footage that had errors in it. So that, I think, is the best thing. That was the best lesson. It's really easy to take something that is beautiful and make it more beautiful. But there was one scene in the first feature I graded where there were two different cameras. They were on the beach, and two different types of camera too. So one was a Panasonic that was really good at the highs and lows, and one was a Canon that was really good at picking up the colors and like was picking up all the magentas, but not the highs and the lows. And it was a windy day. And so there's clouds like scudding over the sun. So the lighting is shifting. It's so cutting between two different cameras with this shifting lighting. And and it's handheld, so if they're turning more towards the sun, it's like backlit. So just the exposures were all over the map, and having to just fight to bring them into some sort of coherence, I think, was the best lesson that I've ever had.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like really that opportunity to dive into the places where the challenge is highest.
Yes.
Both let you build your chops, but then also let you really kind of show those off a little bit more.
I mean, sadly, no, about showing it off, because
Okay.
the best I can hope for in that situation is that it looks less bad. it's like I could be the best colorist in the world, and you can look at that and be like, well, that's okay. But yeah, the before and after, I can really, if you see the before and after, you go, whoa, okay, that is completely different.
Yeah. So how about just, I want to talk about kind of where you're at right now and what's coming next for you in a sec. But on the animation side, like how did getting started with that go? We've talked about it kind of on the colorist side, but how did you get into doing professional animation?
Well, I was, what I specifically was studying when I was in art school was sort of avant-garde art film. So a lot of it had mixed media in it already, and I studied alternative animation styles, so I had a certain amount of like tactile background of a lot of different types. But yeah, I mean, I'd been doing a little bit of that, and there's something that is a little similar between that and compositing, some of the stuff that I do for color. But I've been an artist forever, and so doing working on some of those animations for with the theater in that situation. And then, you know, we worked for a long time with a company that did educational materials for PBS and things like that. So they were doing some projects. I mean, they were doing kind of boring stuff like textbook stuff, but they did a really cool thing on World Explorers, which was originally called Great Explorers, until as they're writing all the scripts and they were realizing what jerks most of these explorers are and how many people they're like mass murdering, and you know, and they're like, well, I guess we'll just have to change that. They're exploring the world, yes, and that's important. They're not great, but so that was really exciting, and we did that was with primary source material. Was really, they had an artist on staff an art historian, I mean, on staff, who would come up with what appropriate artwork of the time and the era of and that specific location, and give us sort of a list of things, and then we could cut them out, animate them. So that was so much fun, because that was the first time I was working with sort of cutting out and animating other people's art too.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'd been doing my own, where I draw a little thing and then animate it. But the idea of this, how do you take a whole scene? Like one of the fun ones we did was Amerigo Vespucci. And we took this whole scene, this beautiful painting with these birds and these mountains in the background, is this whole thing, and cutting it into layers. And then there's just subtle movement, like just a subtle parallax, and the birds kind of, and it was like, oh, I love it. And stuff like that is what made that space feel actually alive. And it was such a simple little thing.
Yeah.
It you know, just like the bird wasn't flapping or anything, it wasn't changing shape, it was just like changing scale slightly. And yeah.
So I mean, that's neat. It seems like it's a theme both between your animation and that colorist work that you do. A lot of it is about that. It's the subtlety and the nuance, and it's like the little things you can do that are evocative, rather than the things that are big and everywhere.
Exactly. I think one of the things that I learned with all those processes is that those things feel very alive in a way that completely just bypasses the sort of uncanny valley of trying to make something feel alive, which is really, I find very fascinating, because that as someone who pays attention to detail, I can go down to the finest little detail of like, well, where in the pupil is this, you know, are we going to put the little light? Like and that is a bottomless pit. Yeah. And the closer and closer I get to the bottom of it, the closer and closer I get to the uncanny valley. Mm. And so instead focusing on these other things that make something feel alive. Yeah. Like, that's been sort of the direction I've taken that.
No, I love that. So what about right now? What are the areas, both in terms of content and in terms of sort of technique or modes you're interested in exploring? What's alive for you right now?
Well, what's really alive for me in sort of the biggest sense is the possibilities of VR and VR storytelling, because one of the things we really learned and with the theater is what we were looking for was to have this provide sort of an alternative format for people to experience moving images. Mm. And yet it was still sort of constrained by the screen and the audience and that sort of dynamic and the popcorn and everything, which was great and it's fun. But it doesn't provide what is possible within immersive experiences. And so try to figure out a good way to describe it. I was often trying at that time with the theater to put together sort of we did some dance parties. We had a live DJ come and DJ to Metropolis. Mm. And some other and the cabinet of Dr. Calgary and things like that. We had these sort of, we were always working to create interactive multimedia immersive experiences within the screen, the feeling of a screen. And the limitations of that were so palpable after pushing it so far. And so the idea of how to tell a narrative that people can experience all around them, and not just experience it, but like have it feel very real. So that's why VR jumps out at me now as the sort of cutting edge for where those things can all be kind of come together. There was another one back when we were in Philadelphia. We would go to Longwood Gardens a lot. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's just one of the biggest gardens in the world. It would belong to the DuPont family, and these fountains bigger than anything in the world, bigger than anything in Las Vegas, and bigger, you know, it's a crazy place. But they have this enormous endowment, so they're just it's just this Disneyland of plants, essentially. But they'd work with artists, and they worked with a group called the Clip Collective, which does projection mapping. And they did all of these sort of just patterns, just abstract patterns, and had all projectors all through the gardens. And so there would be like a fern with like, or like a tree where it was almost like the tree of life, like life kind of growing up it. And then like across a pond, there was a wall of trees, a stand of trees that they projected this whole scene of the seasons changing and birds flying, fish jumping in it, and you know, with music. And it's this, I mean, you can walk for hours through it. And that was the first time that I experienced something that felt like what I was trying to do. Only I like the idea of not having to leave your house. I'm kind of a homebody. No, but it's having that accessible so that you can, everywhere you turn is these immersive elements that feel meaningful, that you can have an emotional interaction with, and can tell an actual story. That's
No, that's wonderful. And I mean, one of the things that strikes me in your work is, I mean, again, it's not just attention to detail in terms of how do we make this look just right or get the style right, but what you're trying to capture, I mean, it is that evocative piece. It's like the sense, the emotional tapestry of stuff that we put around the objects and places that are there. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Like, how does that, I don't even know how to ask it right, but like, how does that work for you, or where do you find your inspiration for that?
It's hard to, it's that is a complicated thing to answer, I think, too. Yeah, it's a hard thing to ask, and I hear what you're asking, and I think that most emotions we filter through language, or we filter through facial expression. I had this experience when we were getting ready to move here. I moved out for a few months, and then and I lived by myself in a little Airbnb with a keypad on it. And every time I'd come to the keypad, I would look up the code, and that happened for about a week and a half. And then a friend came and visited me, and we walked up to the door. I looked it up, and I said it out loud to her. And then from then on, I had it in my memory. And so these little moments where you realize that something isn't really called into being until you name it, or until you find a way to express it. And we're pretty good at that with words, but images and emotional experiences where you can just find that little kernel. Yeah. I had a book at one point called Paintings and Tears, and it was a book about how it was a book of interviews with people who had found themselves unexpectedly crying in front of paintings, and what that had, and why. And one of the ones that stood out to me was looking at a Renaissance painting of and there's a plant just in the corner, and one of the leaves was turned in just this little way, and it had sort of a blue-green shadow on it. And she said something about just seeing it, just the way it was kind of curved and pointed, and the color, it just was so, and she didn't know how to express it. She just started
Yeah.
to cry, and she was thinking of her father, and why is that? What's that connection? But at the same time, I knew exactly what she meant.
Yeah.
And so that inspires me, is why is it that certain things, when done just right,
Yeah.
pull out these emotions, and what are those emotions?
It feels like there's something really critical about that, especially nowadays, where we're such a word-based culture in so many different ways. And as we accelerate and get faster and reduce and digest and try to compress everything down, those feel like there's those pieces that easily get lost. All the stuff that is profoundly nonverbal, and where the stuff that it evokes in us, you don't get to from that verbal place. And so that's just, it's interesting.
Yeah. And that's somewhat what I'm trying to do in this VR project, in the immersive concept, is I'm really hoping that we can express memories that are universal through their specificity, and through the that fine detail where you suddenly remember, like almost like the layer of dust on something that you picked up, that little like Madeline's moment.
Yeah. It's funny because as you were saying that, before you even said the word dust, that was the vivid memory that was there for me of my one of the wood shops of my grandfather,
Oh,
and of
cool.
just that tactile and olfactory just hit of memory that comes with that. So yeah, no, that's really neat. And at some point we're going to do a whole episode that's just on that project, because I mean it's such a neat thing that's going on there. How would you say, in terms of the impact that you hope your work can have? Because I know that another one of those places where I feel like there's a lot of subtlety for you. It feels like you're very you're empathic. You tune in a lot to what's going on and to the significance of what's going on with people,
Yeah.
and whether that's on the individual or the collective side. And you have a lot of understanding and mastery over, like, how do you evoke emotion in these different pieces that you're doing. Given those, like, what if someone can walk away from something you've been involved with, what would you hope that your involvement has helped to either evoke or give for them?
That's a good question. I feel like I have very strong goals that way. And I want, and it's hard, it's similar in the language thing. I want them to feel a little more whole. I'd like them to feel compassion for themselves and others. And I guess I'd like them to feel seen and cared for.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you. What the last couple of years, especially, this speaking about all of this emotional sort of the side and the processing and the subtle stuff that's there, that it's been a year for a lot of the coarse and the big stuff as well, with from pandemic to politics to the isolation that people are feeling often, to the crises and trauma that they've been having to deal with in multiple different directions. How do you see, I mean, art generally, but also kind of your art fitting into that context of all of the stuff that's going on, and what we as a people need to be processing or need to be sorting out?
Yeah, I think, well, people were so connected to people, and yet at the same time, it's almost heightened this interesting experience where people were interacting online rather than leaving the house. And this is something we were dealing with back with the theaters. Like, well, are people going to stream a movie, or are they going to leave the house? And and now, once that decision's been made, like, actually you're not leaving the house. I think people are really wrestling with, first of all, already being pulled in that direction, and the isolation there. And I don't think that as a culture we have a good mechanism for processing grief. I don't think we talk about grief. And I also don't think we talk about, we're very like accomplishment driven society, and we're very productivity based. And so just the sort of act of living and breaking bread together type things, and the sort of tactile human experiences that don't pay the bills necessarily.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and you can't really blog about them, or I don't know, like the types of connections that people can't experience any other way. I think we're hungry for them.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with blogging. Blogging's great. And then any way that people can connect with each other. I've been very excited about the sort of rise of user-generated content, actually. I've been very impressed by that.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's interesting looking at how do we, with all of these new tools and it being easier for people to generate content, how do we aim that content inwards at those pieces that are the pieces that matter, especially when it's very easy to have it be, you know, here's a picture of the sandwich that I ate this morning, as opposed to like, how do you blog about, here's this neat 2-second silence that I shared with my son, with it with like
Yes.
a whole volume of jokes in itself, and all of the pieces around that. Yeah, no, that's really neat.
Yeah. And then also that would, I mean, there's the commodification of that too, that, you know, it's one of the hard things about trying to create art in our society is the way that you have to kind of like pull it in a,
I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. Like, how do you find that confluence, or that bridge point for you between the artistry and what you're wanting to do with that, and the just general commercialization and commoditization of that, but also how you sustain yourself as someone who is trying to make art, real art.
I mean, I made the conscious decision not to focus on art for art's sake. That is something I'm, so on some level, I am not what someone would call a fine artist, because my focus is somewhat commercial, and I am trying to create something that has appeal, that people can access, and that can be a viable vocation. So there, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ethical and wonderful and exciting things that people pay for all the time. I mean, I think that's where I see that for myself.
Yeah.
I had an interesting conversation at one point with someone, an architect, who said, "Oh, well, you know, you can't actually make digital art. Digital art is not a thing, and because there's no way it's to commodify it effectively, because every copy is equal." And I don't care. where is this arbitrary line here? Like that's not part of my process at all.
It's always, I love watching how that goes, you know, through generations or through centuries of what we'll consider to be art, and of what level of height of that art.
Yeah.
And I mean, opera is such a great one, where, you know, it's this boisterous, rowdy, very much of the people thing, and then you fast forward and it's very much this other.
Yes.
That is very, yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, and thinking about, I mean, most people will say, yes, Renaissance art, that is high art, that is fine. And yet here it is, funded by the rich and the church. You know, it's funded by these imperfect funding bodies.
Yeah.
And with very strict rules about what they wanted too. I push back a lot on what I think is sort of the 20th century individualism, and sort of self-expression over everything else. I think that you want to connect with the people who will be interacting with your artwork, and you want to work with them. You don't want to be above them.
Yeah. Well, an interactive and immersive kind of material like you're engaging with now is such a neat opportunity with that, where you really get to, I mean, both in the end product, it is something that can be collaborative, but even in the generative process of having something where people are able to kind of, yeah.
I mean, I love working with people. I love working with creative people. It's so rewarding.
Yeah. Outside of, you know, there's been a lot of talk of the stuff that's related to the core of your work. Outside of work, what are the things that are kind of in your heart and mind as of late? What are the things that are keeping you occupied and engaged?
Well, I've been living in BC for only about 3 years now. And so I have not at all lost any just awe of just being outside around here. It's just amazing. So that I think there are times when I'm, you know, we walk the dog every day, and we live near the Capilano River and near some beautiful woods. And I mean, I'll just stop and there's the way that the ferns grow out the sides of the trees on the moss, and then sometimes on a sunny day the light hits them. Or the other day it had been raining for a long time, but the sun had come out and it was warm. And coming back through sort of a stand of evergreens, the ground, sort of the mist came up and it was backlit. I mean, it was just like a movie set. It was amazing. There was mist coming off the trees. It was just, anyway, I there's nothing more beautiful than those sort of perfect moments. And so I try to look at them.
Yeah.
Every chance I get.
Nice. Oh, that's wonderful. Are there any topics that we haven't dived into, but that you're interested in putting out there or chatting about? What's the question that I should have asked that I didn't?
I don't know. I feel like I mean, on that there's like technical stuff about how stuff is made, but I suppose that's not very engaging because there's all these I mean, it's interesting because I just on a granular basis what I spend much of my time sort of like leaning over a screen and and kind of trying to build the perfect paintbrush in Photoshop, which is usually where I do my painting. So I think I guess I'd say that there's a granularity to the day-to-day work of art. Like we can talk a lot about the heavier, deeper experiences and what our ultimate goals are. And then the more granular side of things, the kind of a lot of my work and a lot of some of the most important parts of my work, because if I want it to actually be successful and be effective, are kind of diving hard into these granular things. Like, do we have, of the 5 or 6 different types of color settings that are all correct, which one, it's so even though the fact, what I always wanted is that every day I get up and I do some form of art, and that is my work. And then I'm like, now I'm done. Going home from work or whatever, or walking out from the home office. And that is my life. And that is what I really wanted. Most of that time is spent doing these granular, kind of repetitive, almost the equivalent of like something that people tend to call like more of a hobby or a craft. There's a lot of craftsmanship in art. And I think that, to me, one of the things, my least favorite painting class I ever took in liberal arts school was one where we were just given free rein within very weird structures, where we were told like, okay, you can only do like triangles and they have to be different kinds of red, but don't make it anything. Right. It was this idea that like you can, I mean, yes, I could also, cut down a tree and try and build a log cabin, but I think that one of the best things about art and about any sort of society is that we have a collective knowledge, and that we can keep building on those things and fine tune them and work together and collaborate and kind of reach greater heights that way. And I don't think that gets recognized in the arts in the same way that it does in other things. It's often this sort of rugged, like, you pioneered a thing, you started, but no, I mean, most people are building on the building blocks. And that's what I do. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting, that piece of, having the inspiration or the big pieces that might be what you're trying to attain, but having to be able to translate that into the deeply nitty gritty, nose to the grindstone, 7 hours working on this little piece to get that effect just right, without losing sight of the fact that, like, oh yeah, this is the thing I'm doing, but doing that looks like this. It looks like all of that fine-tuning, crafting, meticulous work. And I always find it fascinating when people look at someone, I mean, I don't know if you remember from back in the 80s, Nina Hagen was, one with a sort of German punk singer. And that was what she was kind of known for. But I think then someone's kind of asked her about it. She's like, no, like I'm a classically trained operatic singer. Like I know this stuff, and this is how I'm choosing to refine that into a piece. And how often that's what it is that, and the distinction, it's and this is a little bit of a tangent, but just that piece where being able to see that difference between like just doing the thing, and the level of refinement and depth that goes into the craft. And again, for folks like you who really, like, you have this copious background that you're bringing to bear on it, and yeah, the difference in what you can evoke when that's what you're doing. So thank you for what you do with that, and for kind of sharing a little peek under that with us as well.